And I don't think he was the main person. I think he was the guy outside who was waiting for them to come out. Because if you have a gate like that, a security gate on the front door, you're not getting into that. You're never going to break into that security gate.
For 44 consecutive days, law enforcement and armchair detectives alike have obsessed over one specific detail regarding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. We wanted to know exactly how the masked man on her porch managed to cross the threshold. Ring camera video clearly captures him hovering at the entrance during the early morning hours of February 1st, 2026. His face is obscured, hands gloved, a backpack slung over his shoulder, and a firearm holstered on his right hip. Analysts have reviewed that clip hundreds of times, breaking down every micro-expression and every single second he lingered on that concrete step. They needed to explain how a stranger breached an 84-year-old woman's residence at midnight without stirring her from sleep. He somehow bypassed the neighbors and completely avoided leaving the massive structural damage you normally see during a home invasion. People speculated about lockpicks, stolen spare keys, and unlatched ground floor windows. Some wondered if Nancy slept through the intrusion because she was completely deaf without her medical devices. The truth is, everyone was chasing the wrong lead entirely. A crucial structural detail at the front of the Guthrie property completely shatters the official narrative of what happened that morning. It was hiding in plain sight on the video feed and showed up clearly in every single real estate photo. Property records noted it, and any local resident living in similar southwestern architecture already knew about it. Yet the public completely missed it until a recent breakthrough. Nancy Guthrie's main entrance was protected by a heavy security gate. We are not talking about a standard wooden frame and a cheap deadbolt. This was industrial-grade wrought-iron mesh. Encased in steel, these barriers are specifically engineered to withstand brute force and require heavy power tools to breach. Cutting through one means generating sustained, deafening noise and leaving mangled metal that crime scene technicians would have spotted immediately. A resident living just 4 doors down happens to have the exact same model installed on her property. She confirmed that the individual caught on tape could never have smashed his way through that specific entrance. The physical limitations make it impossible. He lingered for 41 minutes, and his hands held absolutely no cutting equipment. Any real attempt would have triggered alarms across the entire block, leaving only one logical conclusion. Someone unlatched that door from the inside. That single realization alters the entire trajectory of the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Let's pause to establish clear boundaries on the facts we are presenting right now. What follows is an analysis backed by locals who intimately understand Catalina Foothills home security. Open-source intelligence and retired federal agents working the case file strongly support these structural claims. We are not pointing fingers at any specific individual. Law enforcement has made 0 arrests and filed 0 charges. Authorities have officially and permanently cleared the Guthrie family of any involvement. We are simply following the trail the physical evidence leaves behind. If a reinforced iron mesh prevented any chance of a break-in, what actually allowed this intruder to walk right in? Detectives, hardware specialists, and local residents all circle back to one inescapable conclusion. He had an inside contact. To understand the mechanics of that night, we need to look at the victim. 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie vanished from her residence, tucked away in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona, just as the sun rose on February 1st, 2026. She called Tucson home for over half a century. After losing her husband Charles back in 1988, she single-handedly raised 3 children. Charles was just 49 when a Mexican mining expedition claimed his life. Nancy remained a fixture in the community, attending Sunday service religiously and befriending everyone on her block. Fiercely independent, she handled her own finances and chose to live alone in a quiet $1 million estate. Her neighborhood featured massive setbacks, with properties divided by raw desert scrub, towering saguaro cacti, and intense seclusion. It offered the exact kind of isolation affluent southwestern retirees actively seek out. But her health was failing. She lacked the strength to walk even 50 yards unassisted. A chronic heart condition forced her onto a strict daily regimen. Missing either her morning or evening pills meant certain death. Surgeons had also implanted a pacemaker inside her chest, which constantly transmitted data to an iPhone application via Bluetooth. This tech tracked her cardiac rhythm, second by second. She also relied on heavy-duty hearing aids, pulling them out every single night before sleep. They always sat on the bedside table right next to her smartphone. Once those devices came out, her world went totally silent. She was incapable of hearing shouts, rustling, or the heavy boots of an intruder pacing outside her bedroom door. The frail widow barely weighed 150 pounds. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, she caught a rideshare to her daughter Annie's place, just a few miles down the road. They had planned a simple family dinner and board game night. The car dropped her off around 5:32 p.m., kicking off a perfectly mundane gathering. Food, laughs, and casual stories filled the room, a classic Saturday night for a tight-knit family trying to make memories together. Nothing about those final hours hinted at what was waiting for her back home. Right around 9:50 that night, another driver dropped Nancy off at her house. The garage door cycled up, then shut tight. She was securely indoors. From all appearances, perfectly safe. Her nightly routine seemed undisturbed. Pills sat ready on the kitchen counter, while her phone rested right next to her hearing aids on the bedroom nightstand. Every trace of her existence remained exactly as she positioned it earlier that evening. Over the following 14 hours, total silence consumed the property. Not a single phone call, text message, or drop-in visit happened. To confirm, this 84-year-old woman who relied on a pacemaker for a serious cardiac condition had actually swallowed her nightly pills, or tucked herself securely under the covers. No late-night panic from a concerned relative triggered the eventual missing persons report. Nobody sensed sudden danger and sounded the alarm. The actual catalyst came from a church friend who reached out to Nancy's daughter, Annie, at 11:56 the next morning, February 1st. This caller simply noted the elderly woman had vanished from their online Sunday worship stream, a commitment she never missed under any circumstances. Annie immediately drove over to check the property, walking through every single room. She combed through the entire yard. What she discovered were all the essentials: wallet, keys, pills, hearing aids, a phone, and a vehicle parked securely inside the garage. Every worldly possession tied to Nancy Guthrie sat untouched inside that structure. The only thing missing was the homeowner herself. At precisely 12:03 that afternoon, panicked relatives dialed 911, yet by the time dispatch answered, the actual event had already concluded almost a full 10 hours prior. Sheriff Chris Nanos locked down the ensuing timeline during official briefings, backed entirely by formal FBI statements and fully sourced intelligence provided to mainstream journalists. On February 1st, 2026, at exactly 1:47 in the morning, someone manually killed the feed on the Nest camera guarding Nancy Guthrie's front porch. Nanos laid out this specific detail while addressing reporters on February 5th. While detectives refused to specify the exact method used to sever the connection, the sheriff explicitly ruled out dead batteries or random software glitches. The underlying message left no room for interpretation. An intruder intentionally neutralized the surveillance lens right before breaching the residence. By 2:12 in the morning, localized motion sensors picked up active movement across the grounds. Yet the system recorded zero visual evidence, entirely due to that prior blackout. Then, at 2:28, the digital handshake between Nancy's pacemaker and her iPhone abruptly dropped. The mobile device sat perfectly still. It rested in its usual nightly spot right next to the hearing aids on her bedside table. Andrew McCabe, a former deputy director for the FBI currently analyzing law enforcement data for CNN, broke down the significance of this detail with journalist Brian Enton. Whenever internal medical hardware drops a Bluetooth tether to a local monitor, McCabe explained that mere physical separation almost always triggers the alert. These transmitters operate on an incredibly tight wireless leash. The second a patient travels outside that specific radius, all connectivity instantly vanishes. Someone was forcibly extracting Nancy from her own bedroom. She had physically exited the structure moments before the data feed went dark. Only 8 minutes later, at 2:36, a private Ring doorbell owned by Elias and Danielle Strategoulas, neighbors residing roughly 2.5 miles away, caught a suspicious car navigating through their subdivision. Liz Kreutz from NBC News later mapped and drove the exact path connecting the two properties. The journey clocked in at precisely 6 minutes. Factor in the medical disconnect at 2:28, plus 6 minutes of transit, and the car arriving on Lens at 2:36. That leaves exactly 2 minutes unaccounted for. Just enough time for a driver to kill the headlights, grip the wheel, and steady their nerves, before merging onto empty back roads at 2:30 in the morning with 150 pounds of human cargo concealed in the trunk. That crucial piece of security footage sat well beyond the initial investigative boundaries. Pima County deputies established a strict 2-mile grid around the crime scene. The Strategulous property rested a solid half-mile past that cutoff. Detectives never knocked on their door. The couple actually flagged down authorities independently, recognizing a direct match between the local broadcast timeline and their own security archives. Yet when the first badge finally crossed Nancy's threshold at 12:03 that afternoon, 11 whole hours after the Lens went blind, crime scene techs immediately spotted blood pooling across the concrete porch, smeared on the main entry and staining the driveway. Lab technicians at the Pima County Sheriff's Department ran swift DNA diagnostics and secured a definitive match. The fluid belonged to Nancy Guthrie. Maureen O'Connell, a retired FBI special agent who spent decades dissecting forensic environments, evaluated high-resolution photos of those stains and publicly broke down the physics. The crimson drops fell at a perfect 90-degree angle from an elevated, static position. Investigators found absolutely zero gaps indicating shoe prints, no sideways smears, not a single drag mark on the pavement. When speaking on the record with Brian and Ton, her professional conclusion left zero room for debate. Someone had tightly swaddled the victim, most likely utilizing thick bedding or a heavy sheet, and hoisted her out the main entrance. She never took a single step out of that residence under her own volition. In response, federal agents spent 10 grueling days alongside Google engineers digging deep to pull what FBI Director Kash Patel deemed latent residual data buried within the back-end architecture of that disabled Nest device. The homeowner maintained absolutely no premium cloud subscription. According to standard operating protocol, any video bypassing external servers is held entirely, normally stays right on the device. Smash the camera, and the footage disappears. But Google engineers managed to pull what Patel described as residual data, broken fragments of video. These tiny files had bounced to Google servers during split-second connections right before the camera died. Extracting that data took 10 agonizing days of technical grinding. The result was the exact imagery plastered across every major American news network. It shows a masked figure standing on Nancy Guthrie's front porch. He moves with total confidence, displaying what body language experts publicly dubbed ownership behavior. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't scan the yard. He drops his head and marches straight for the lens like a man who already mapped the layout. He taps the glass twice to check for power, then obscures the view with leaves ripped right out of a nearby potted plant. From these broken clips, the FBI built a profile. They identified a male suspect standing roughly 5'9" to 5'10" inches. He has an average build, completely masking his face, dressed in dark clothing and wearing black nitrile gloves. He carries a 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack sold exclusively at Walmart, and wears a gun holster strapped to his right hip. Forensic imaging experts also spotted a possible tattoo peeking out from the glove on his right wrist. Then a crucial detail emerged. ABC News, CBS News, CNN, and Fox News all independently confirmed the same disturbing fact. One specific frame showing the man without his backpack came from an entirely different day. This wasn't his first time at the house. He had already run a reconnaissance mission to study the target. He checked the angles to guarantee his plan would hold up. He walked away, and then he returned. You have to understand that prior visit to grasp the reality of the security gate. Just look at any photograph of Nancy Guthrie's front entryway. News crews flooded the internet with these pictures, making the setup obvious in every single piece of media coverage. A heavy security gate sits mounted right over the main wooden door. This is not some cheap decorative iron. It isn't just an artistic choice. This is a hardcore functional barrier forged from wrought iron or steel mesh. The metal is powder-coated for weather resistance and locked into a steel frame anchored deep into the door jamb and surrounding wall. You see these barriers everywhere across the Southwest, especially in Arizona and Southern California. Homes constructed there during the 1970s and 1980s relied on these gates as their primary line of defense. The engineering is simple but incredibly effective. The gate swings out on heavy-duty hinges and secures shut with a solid deadbolt. That bolt sinks straight into a strike plate inside the doorframe. If you leave the interior wooden door open, the setup lets fresh air blow through the mesh while keeping out bugs, stray animals, and anyone who doesn't belong. Homeowners get pure ventilation without giving up an ounce of safety. They can easily look out at whoever walks up. They can talk right through the steel mesh without ever unlatching the lock. These barriers exist for one very specific reason. They force intruders to use heavy tools, waste precious time, and make enough noise to wake up the whole street. Battering through one leaves unmistakable evidence. Nancy's neighbor Laura explained this perfectly on camera to NBC correspondent Brian Enton. During that interview broadcast on March 16th, Laura mentioned she had lived in the Catalina Foothills for over a decade. She actually has the exact same security barrier protecting her own house. When she watched the released video, watching the masked man at Nancy's porch, Laura instantly realized something that viewers from outside the region totally missed. This intruder was never planning to breach that front door. She explained it with absolute calm. She spoke with the dead certainty of someone who trusts these systems every single night, stating plainly, "You are not breaking into those gates. You are never going to break into that security gate." She even added that she had recently consulted a professional. Just 2 or 3 weeks prior, a security expert had told her the exact same thing. Laura wasn't just guessing here. She laid out the hard physical reality known to anyone who relies on this kind of steel barrier. Forcing your way through requires heavy bolt cutters to snap the mesh or a massive pry bar to warp the steel frame. Otherwise, you need brutal leverage and a lot of time to tear the mounting bolts right out of the wood. Any of those tactics would create an absolute racket. All of them would destroy the metal in ways you couldn't miss. And doing that kind of damage eats the clock. The suspect only spent 41 minutes inside the house, so wasting several minutes exposed on a lit porch makes no sense. Not with a doorbell camera potentially rolling and neighbors sleeping right next door. Plus, the man in the video isn't holding any tools. He has no bolt cutters. He carries no pry bar. In certain frames, you can clearly see his hands. They are gloved and totally empty. Aside from the leaves he shoved over the lens, he simply isn't geared up for a heavy breach. You don't tackle a steel barrier in the dead of night empty-handed. And when detectives finally pulled up to Nancy's property 11 hours later, they found the gate completely untouched. No bent steel, no sliced mesh, zero signs of forced entry at the front gate. Laura completely rejects the idea that this suspect broke through the main entrance. Instead, she thinks he was just standing on the porch, waiting for an inside man to turn the knob. She broke down this exact sequence of events step by step while speaking with reporter Brian Enton. We need to look closely at her perspective. This is not some random internet sleuth guessing from 1,000 miles away. This comes directly from a local resident who navigates those same streets and knows exactly how those specific neighborhood security systems operate. She has spent the past 44 days obsessing over the mechanics of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, realizing that the official story simply does not add up. According to Laura, the person caught on tape was not the primary attacker. He was the cleanup crew, stationed outside and waiting for the signal. Her logic is bulletproof. Those heavy-duty security grates do not budge. You cannot just muscle your way past them. She suspects he was peering through the gaps to monitor the situation inside. Rewatch the surveillance video with that theory in mind. The figure stands perfectly still at the threshold, no yanking on the handle, no attempts to pry it open. He never even tests the deadbolt. He just waits with his head bowed, which led Laura to spot another crucial detail. Twin glass panels flank Nancy's entryway. If the solid wooden door behind the exterior metal grate is left ajar, a common practice on hot nights to catch a breeze, anyone outside can easily look straight through the steel mesh and glass sidelights into the living room. But once that solid door shuts, or the interior lights cut out, visibility drops to absolute zero. Laura is convinced this man was straining to see inside, checking if his partner was ready, and verifying that their operation was proceeding on schedule. She pushed the theory even further. She argues a co-conspirator was already inside the home, preparing to extract Nancy. The man on the porch was simply holding his position until the inside operative popped the lock. He needed that access to help carry her out. Think about how this mechanical execution would actually unfold in the real world. An intruder breaches the home sometime prior to 1:47 in the morning. They had multiple options for getting inside. They might have arrived earlier in the evening, slipping past her defenses by posing as a friendly face. A familiar neighbor, a repair technician, or a late delivery driver, anyone with a convincing excuse to ring the bell. Nancy was deeply trusting. She had spent decades in that exact community without a single problem. She would have unhesitatingly unlatched the deadbolt for a safe-looking visitor, or perhaps the killers did not even need her permission. A regular handyman, a contractor, or an acquaintance holding a spare emergency key. They could have casually walked right through the front door or bypassed security entirely through an unsecured window. This requires intimate knowledge of her daily habits. They knew exactly which access points she routinely forgot to secure. Regardless of the method, someone was already lurking inside when she finally went to sleep. She arrived home at 9:50 that night, putting her bedtime somewhere around 10 or 10:30. Then, the intruder just sat there. They waited for hours in the dark. They demanded total silence, deep sleep, and the absolute lowest possible risk of neighborhood detection. At exactly 1:47 in the morning, the front security camera goes dark. No shattered glass. Nobody ripped the unit off the siding. They neutralized it using a method they thought would permanently wipe the footage. That strategy failed completely thanks to Google's cloud backups, but it successfully blinded the system in real time. Sometime during the blind spot between 1:47 and 2:28 in the morning, the backup arrived on the porch. The inside man expected him. The sink was perfect. The deadbolts clicked. The metal grate swung open, and the wooden barrier cleared. The outside muscle stepped into the house. Here is where the logistics get brutal. The two of them dragged Nancy from her room straight to the foyer. They bundled her tightly in heavy material, a calculated move to trap the massive blood loss from her injuries. They hoisted her out into the night, loaded her into a waiting transport, and vanished. Just minutes later, at 2:36 in the morning, a neighborhood surveillance lens caught them driving 2.5 miles down the road. This is not some baseless internet fantasy. This exact timeline maps perfectly onto the hard forensic evidence. The metal grate showed zero damage. The solid door lacked pry marks. That 41-minute void between the lens shutting off and the pacemaker losing signal tells a very specific story. It points directly to precise, calculated movements inside those walls. A solo burglar would be panicking. They would be frantically wrestling a victim, tearing through drawers for cash, and sprinting for the exit. But look at the blood evidence. The drops fell at a perfect 90-degree angle. No smears, no drag marks. That exact splatter pattern happens when two people carry a heavy load, watching their step to avoid leaving a messy trail. Laura also pointed out the brutal physical reality of hauling dead weight. Trying to single-handedly transport an unresponsive or struggling elderly victim is nearly impossible, a fact she understood completely from her own history of caring for. Laura recalled caring for her own mother, who weighed 120 pounds. That was 30 pounds lighter than Nancy. Just guiding her mother up 3 or 4 stairs took immense physical effort, and that was with her mother actively trying to help. It was difficult in broad daylight, with zero pressure and no need for silence. Now, picture a single person trying to carry Nancy Guthrie. She weighed 150 pounds. She had limited mobility. She might have been unconscious, or she could have been violently fighting back. Moving her out of that house and down those porch steps would be an absolute nightmare. Hauling that dead weight across a driveway and loading her into a vehicle in total silence without dropping her, leaving drag marks, or smearing bloody handprints is almost impossible. For a lone attacker, the logistics simply do not work. But for two people working together, the math changes entirely. If an accomplice was already waiting inside that house, controlling the security gate, the entire narrative shifts. That front door footage is no longer a video of a break-in. It becomes a record of two people executing a perfectly rehearsed operation. The man on the porch was never trying to force his way inside. He was just waiting for his cue. Exactly 5 pieces of evidence point straight toward an inside accomplice working with an outside partner. Look at them individually, and they raise serious questions. Layer them together, and you get a very specific pattern that points in only one direction. Point 1 is the reconnaissance visit. Sources confirmed this independently to 4 major news networks: ABC News, CBS News, CNN, and Fox News. They verified that a doorbell camera image showed the suspect without a backpack. That specific image was captured on an entirely different day than the footage showing him wearing a backpack on the night Nancy vanished. He was not there to disable the camera or take Nancy during that first trip. He was strictly gathering intelligence. He walked right up to the front door during the day or early evening when a stranger draws less attention. He studied the property. He located the camera. He memorized the layout. Most importantly, he needed to physically verify the details fed to him by someone who knew the property intimately. An insider could easily describe the security gate, the exact camera placement, and Nancy's daily routine, along with the perfect window to strike. A physical walkthrough makes perfect sense, because hearing about a layout and standing in it are 2 entirely different things. Walking up to that door and staring down that security gate, figuring out the mechanics of the latch, and marking exactly where a person needs to stand to unlock it from the inside, that requires boots on the ground. You cannot get that level of precision secondhand. This early visit proves our suspect was not operating on impulse. He was methodically planning every step, and if he was coordinating with an insider, this dry run was his final check before executing the hit. The second piece of evidence centers around the camera, which was disabled externally but required inside knowledge to exploit. That doorbell camera went dark at exactly 1:47 a.m. The FBI and Google spent 10 grueling days extracting footage from back-end systems. The suspect clearly thought he had permanently killed the feed, but he made a critical error. Engineers managed to scrape together residual data that transmitted to Google's servers right before the device lost power. Still, the attempt to disable it shows a high level of operational awareness. Nancy did not actually pay for a cloud subscription for her Nest camera. And that is a highly specific detail. You cannot figure that out just by standing on the porch. The camera is mounted right on the doorframe, looking exactly like every other Nest doorbell on the market. There are no warning signs indicating whether the device uploads to the cloud or not. Only someone familiar with her account would know that blind spot. It had to be someone who had been inside the house and seen the setup firsthand. Someone who fully understood that destroying the physical device would kill the local recording, even if it left a slight digital footprint on the back end. An inside accomplice could have easily passed that technical vulnerability to the suspect on the porch. Based on that intel, the attacker made a logical, though ultimately flawed assumption that smashing the camera at 1:47 a.m. would wipe out any visual record of his next move. The third piece of evidence is the complete lack of forced entry. Investigators found 0 damage to the heavy security gate. They found no damage to the solid wooden door. There are no shattered windows, no fresh pry marks, and absolutely none of the violent traces that a break-in leaves behind. Forcing entry into a secured home always leaves a scar. You would see gouges on the gate frame from a crowbar, sliced wire mesh from bolt cutters, splintered wood from a kicked door, or shards of glass scattered across the floor. The total absence of physical damage limits the point of entry to exactly 3 possibilities. The killer used a key, got an inside assist to open the door, or slipped through a window left unlocked by Nancy. Or perhaps someone with prior access intentionally left it unlocked. If we look at the key theory, we have to ask where it came from. Nancy was incredibly cautious and never handed keys to strangers. But she did occasionally give them to service providers, trusted neighbors, and people who had legitimate reasons to walk through her front door. But if a person manually opened that door from the inside, it guarantees we are looking at an inside job. And if they exploited an unlocked window, they still needed a terrifying level of access to her daily routine. They knew her schedule. They knew which doors stayed locked, which ones she'd forget, and exactly when the house went quiet for the night. Every single theory leads to the exact same conclusion. Whoever did this had walked those halls before. Then there's the timeline. The camera went dark at 1:47 a.m., and Nancy's pacemaker lost its connection at 2:28 a.m., leaving an exact window of 41 minutes. Imagine pulling this off solo in that tight time frame. First, you have to break in. Navigate a pitch-black, unfamiliar floor plan without a sound. Locate Nancy's room. Finally, overpower an 84-year-old woman who could wake up, fight back, or scream. If this was a robbery, you also have to hunt for valuables. Then, locate material to wrap her body. Haul her from the bedroom all the way to the front entrance. Maneuver her down the porch steps, drag her across the driveway, and load her into a getaway car. Then, vanish. 41 minutes feels like an eternity when you're committing a violent home invasion. The clock is the enemy here. Every passing minute drastically multiplies the danger of her waking up and shouting for help. The danger of a neighbor catching a suspicious noise. The chance of a random car passing by and spotting your vehicle idling outside. Or the sheer panic of leaving behind a single stray hair, dropping a tool, or making that one fatal mistake that lands you in prison. Your average intruder hits a house hard and bolts immediately. Spending 41 minutes inside points to a completely different operation. Picture a two-man crew. One guy is already inside, the other slips in right after the camera gets cut. Suddenly, those 41 minutes make perfect sense as the time needed to operate with absolute precision. Time to secure Nancy carefully to avoid spilling more blood. Time to wrap her tight enough to contain the mess. Time to carry her out smoothly without slipping. Time to load her into the trunk out of sight. Time to scrub down countertops and doorknobs just in case your gloves left a smudge. You even have a moment to sweep the room for left-behind evidence. A coordinated duo can afford to be methodical. A lone wolf would be scrambling. Next, we have to look at the blood evidence and the sheer physics of transporting a human body. Enter Maureen O'Connell, a former FBI special agent. She brought decades of crime scene analysis to the table and reviewed photos of the stains left on Nancy's front porch. Her forensic breakdown was incredibly specific. She noted blood droplets dropping at a perfect right angle from a fixed height. There were 0 shoe prints breaking up the stains, no smears, absolutely no drag marks. Everything about that pattern screams that the victim was carried. Here's the problem. Lugging a 150-pound person wrapped in heavy material, especially if she's dead weight or fighting back, is physically grueling. Laura, who used to take care of her own aging mother, mentioned how exhausting it was just to help her up the stairs, even when her mom weighed less and was actively helping. Nancy was considerably heavier. She also struggled with basic mobility, even on a good day when she actually wanted to move. If someone knocked her out or if she fought for her life, hauling her out of there would take serious muscle and teamwork. Imagine one guy trying to lug Nancy all the way from her bedroom, out the front door, and down those steep porch steps you can see in the crime scene photos. Getting her loaded into a car solo wouldn't be completely impossible, but it would be a massive struggle. And struggling leads to mistakes. One slip, and you drop the body. You leave more blood behind. You make a loud thud that alerts the street. Add a second guy, and suddenly the job is smooth. One takes the shoulders, the other grabs the legs, and they move perfectly in sync. They can both watch their footing. If her body shifts or the weight gets awkward, they just adjust their grip and keep moving. The blood evidence on the porch doesn't definitively prove a two-man job, but it aligns perfectly with one. Factor in the bypass security gate, the 41-minute timeline, the unforced entry, and whoever possessed the specific technical know-how to kill that camera. At that point, a two-person crew stops sounding like a wild theory and becomes the only logical explanation that fits the facts. Just when things seem to stall out, the FBI hit Laura with a question that completely caught the public off guard. They wanted to know if she had any video from January 24th, 2026. That specific date had never once popped up in the media. Suddenly, detectives were zeroing in on it with the exact same fierce intensity they aimed at January 11th. Laura revealed to Brian Enton that federal agents showed up at her doorstep on Friday, March 14th, a mere 48 hours before her interview hit the airwaves. They specifically requested to see her security tape from that exact day. They didn't just ask for it. They physically sat down beside her and analyzed the clips frame by frame. They were hunting for a needle in a haystack. January 24th landed exactly 8 days before Nancy vanished, and it happened to fall on a Saturday. January 11th, the day detectives previously zeroed in on while questioning the neighborhood, was also a Saturday. And February 1st, the morning Nancy was abducted, marked yet another Saturday. 3 consecutive Saturdays, 3 specific points in time that law enforcement firmly believes are linked. If the perpetrator worked a standard Monday through Friday job, someone stuck in an office who simply couldn't risk doing broad daylight surveillance during the week. Then Saturday offered the perfect window to cruise the Catalina Foothills completely under the radar. No need to fake a sick day. No awkward questions from a boss. Just wide open time to plan a perfect crime. People who could eventually recall him missing in action, acting distant, or probing for unusual details. Detectives seem to be establishing a clear timeline. The target area saw its first visit from the perpetrator on January 11th. We believe this was when the initial scouting video was recorded, showing him without a bag. He strolled directly to NY's front entrance and stared right into the lens. He studied the protective fencing. He was verifying every detail fed to him by his internal source. Then came January 24th. His exact movements during this second trip remain a total mystery. Laura's security setup logged nothing but local animals crossing her yard, though nearby residents could possess crucial recordings. Surrounding lenses might have caught a car, a shadowy figure, or simple movements that felt completely normal back then. Look at those same clips, knowing what unfolded 7 days later, and everything changes. That brings us to February 1st. For more Canas, look at those same clips of Nooning Deshay. He arrived equipped with a bag, hand protection, and a deadly strategy. 3 consecutive Saturdays meant 3 distinct trips. He used each weekend to sharpen his entry, clock his speed, and guarantee his victim lacked protection. Nobody just stumbled into this situation. We are not looking at a drifter cruising down random streets until they spotted an unlatched deadbolt or an empty driveway. Spontaneous decisions played zero role here. Every single step was calculated and executed by a person who spent countless days, and maybe even months, engineering the events of February 1st. You only dedicate that kind of energy when you are absolutely convinced the payoff is substantial enough, spurred on by promises of a flawless execution. An informant handed over precise, highly guarded intel that made the immense danger seem entirely acceptable. Laura mentioned another highly specific detail during her questioning, and it reveals exactly how advanced this intruder actually was. Federal agents pressed her on whether her home network lost connection during the late hours of February 1st. Law enforcement never drops a question like that by accident. They only bring it up when evidence points toward a deliberate blackout of the entire local grid. Slicing the communications lines was likely baked into the strategy. Should the primary actor or his mole have severed web access to the block, right before 1:47 a.m., a massive pile of disjointed evidence suddenly snaps clearly into focus. Detectives and armchair sleuths alike have battled these loose threads from day one. A blackout perfectly accounts for NY's mobile device, abandoned right next to her earpieces on the bedside table, failing to broadcast a single geographic coordinate following her abduction. Today's cellular tech endlessly chats with local routers and signal masts to maintain a constant geographic footprint. Assume her device was locked onto the house router, and that specific network suddenly flatlined the exact moment. Regional tower signals vanished entirely. Her screen would pin her final coordinates to the residence before plunging into total darkness. Zero network handshakes meant absolute digital silence, leaving authorities with absolutely nothing to track. That same outage clarifies why surrounding property lenses missed every single car rolling in or out of the subdivision during the vital strike window. High-end domestic surveillance rigs, exactly like the ones protecting these upscale Catalina Foothills estates, require active broadband to pump their video streams straight up to remote servers. Take away the web access while the intruder navigates the streets, and those devices are forced to dump files onto their tiny internal memory chips. Remote backups become impossible. Unless the target walked squarely into the immediate field of view, or the homeowner aimed their lens specifically at the road instead of the garage, the digital record stays completely blank. We finally understand why NY's front entryway Nest lens completely failed to sync with the Google servers as the event went down. The FBI tech teams and corporate programmers burned 10 full days, pulling digital ghosts from the deepest levels of the hardware. The system simply lacked an uplink when it mattered most. If someone murdered the connection, the hardware became a brick, pointing straight to an offender whose specialized skill set drastically shrinks the suspect list. Plunging a suburban block into the dark ages involves a few distinct methodologies. The bluntest approach requires physically slashing the broadband cables, pumping data directly into the subdivision. You can easily reach these conduits through green metal street boxes, central relay stations, and exposed pole wiring. Give a guy even a rudimentary background in telecom networks, and he tracks down the correct hub, pops the lid, and snips the master feed using heavy shears. The blackout happens in a fraction of a second. Every single house wired to that grid instantly drops off the map. Unless a resident actually dialed their telecom provider to complain, a rare move at 2 in the morning, the damage goes completely unnoticed until repair crews punch in the following day. Then there is the frequency blocking approach. Handheld devices built to scramble cellular signals violate federal law across the country, yet anyone with an internet connection can order them from overseas manufacturers, hardware packing enough wattage to a signal jammer powerful enough to knock out an entire residential area like Catalina Foothills wouldn't require a van. It would fit right inside a standard backpack. Look closely at the doorbell footage. The suspect has one strapped securely over his shoulders. If he packed a jamming device instead of burglary tools, that answers a major question. It explains exactly why he brought the bag right up to the front porch. It also explains why he kept it on his person for the entire operation. This level of sabotage requires serious planning. It demands specialized technical skills. The perpetrators knew exactly how to weaponize internet and cellular connections, turning a modern security system into a blind spot. Your average burglar doesn't even consider severing a Wi-Fi connection. They certainly lack the telecommunications expertise to pinpoint which specific cables to slash or what radio frequencies to block. Street-level offenders operate entirely in the physical world. They pick locks, smash glass, and overpower targets, completely ignoring the massive digital footprints they leave in their wake. This suspect operated on an entirely different level. They mastered the digital landscape. That kind of precision points to professional training, a deep background in IT or telecommunications, or they received explicit coaching from an expert. Laura told authorities she never noticed her network drop that night. She was fast asleep. Unless she woke up, grabbed her phone, and saw the missing Wi-Fi icon, she would remain completely oblivious. Even if she had checked, she likely would have dismissed it as a random service glitch and closed her eyes. But a crucial detail slipped through the cracks. Laura switched internet providers exactly 2 weeks after Nancy vanished. That switch wiped her access to the early February service logs records that could prove a targeted blackout. Luckily, she wasn't the only one on the grid. The FBI is actively asking questions about network failures. That suggests they already possess hard evidence from internet service providers. They might have data from neighbors who track their networks or smart devices that logged connectivity drops right during the critical time frame. An intentional digital blackout changes everything. It elevates this from a random crime to a highly coordinated, tactical operation. It proves 2 distinct elements merged: intimate inside knowledge of the target and high-level technical execution. If an insider actually collaborated with an external operator, the entire trajectory of this investigation flips upside down. Law enforcement is no longer just hunting the masked man caught on the porch camera. They are tracking a minimum of 2 suspects. One secured access to Nancy's home, while the other physically executed the abduction. There might even be a third player involved, assuming the insider and the tech expert are 2 separate individuals hiding in plain sight. Finding who had access to Nancy's life narrows the suspect pool down to very specific, highly identifiable groups. You can cross the family off the list. Sheriff Chris Nanos went on the record on February 16th with a definitive statement. He officially cleared the entire Guthrie family. Every sibling, every spouse, none of them are suspects. He slammed any rumors of family involvement as flat-out cruel. That clearance remains absolute. It is undisputed and crystal clear. But that leaves a massive, glaring vulnerability that detectives are aggressively tearing apart. Think about the service providers who stepped foot on that property over the last few years. The housekeepers, the crews who maintained the landscaping and serviced the pool, the contractors hired to patch the roof, install appliances, or renovate the interior. Regular delivery drivers also pose a threat. They interacted with Nancy frequently enough to map out her daily habits. Rideshare drivers could easily glance inside the foyer every time they picked her up or dropped her off. Then there are caregivers. Given Nancy's restricted mobility, any home health aides would possess intimate knowledge of her daily vulnerabilities. Finally, consider the neighbors. Some dropped by for social visits, while others might have held on to a spare key for emergencies. Investigators can tear through every single one of these groups. They can subpoena service invoices and dig through employment history. They can run deep background checks. Analysts can pull cell tower dumps to pinpoint exactly whose phones pinged near the house on January 11th. They can do the exact same for January 24th and February 1st. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer has weighed in heavily on this angle. As one of the most vocal experts analyzing the evidence, she keeps hammering home a very specific point. Her leading theory points straight to a tangential connection. Someone hovering on the edges of Nancy's life leaked critical insider knowledge to the actual perpetrators. She elaborated on this exact scenario during major interviews with Newsweek and the Daily Mail. It starts with family. Though she acknowledges law enforcement completely ruled them out, that leaves the hired help. The pool guy, the maid, the handyman who fixed the sink. It had to be someone trusted with access. Interestingly, Coffindaffer doesn't believe the informant actually wanted Nancy to get hurt. She suggests a much more innocent, yet fatal, mistake. While doing their jobs and making small talk, they chatted with a warm, incredibly trusting older woman, unintentionally compiling a perfect blueprint for a predator. Someone might have casually mentioned how vulnerable Nancy was. They likely had zero idea how that information would eventually be weaponized. A passing comment to a friend. A story told to a relative. A quick chat with a business associate. They might have bragged about working at a massive estate up in the Catalina Foothills. They could have mentioned the wealthy, older woman living there by herself, or pointed out her limited mobility. Maybe they brought up her famous daughter. Maybe they talked about the $1 million property value, or noted her habit of turning the lights out early. Or maybe they shared the most dangerous detail of all. Once she took her hearing aids out for the night, the house went completely silent to her. Innocent conversation. Zero malicious intent. But those exact details could have easily landed in the lap of someone looking for a target. Someone who started asking follow-up questions. Someone who started drawing up a plan. This brings us to the security gate theory. If getting inside required physical keys or someone opening the door from within, a casual tip-off was not enough. The insider had to be deeply involved. They needed to be physically present in that house on that specific night, ready to act, ready to unlock that security gate, ready to help physically carry Nancy out the door. That reality shrinks the suspect pool drastically. It completely rules out the careless talkers who would never actually stomach real violence. It points directly at someone harboring a serious motive. Someone who wanted a lot more than just a finder's fee. A desperate need for cash. A bitter personal grudge. Intense pressure from an outside accomplice. Something pushed them over the edge, turning an informant into an active predator. Detectives are hunting for exactly that individual. The physical evidence speaks volumes. The untouched security gate. The absolute lack of forced entry. The perfectly coordinated timeline. Combine that with intimate knowledge of the camera layout and the strategic internet blackout. It all forces the investigation down one highly specific path. Then came March 13th. 3 days before Laura's interview hit the airwaves. Sheriff Chris Nanas sat down with NBC News. What followed was a brief exchange that deeply unsettled the community, raising immediate red flags about what law enforcement actually knew. The reporter asked a simple question. Do you think this perpetrator could strike again? Nanos did not hesitate. Absolutely. He had never admitted that on the record before. During previous press briefings, the sheriff kept things strictly procedural. He confirmed the family was cleared. He assured the public they had strong leads. He even maintained hope they would find Nancy alive. But he had expertly dodged the real question keeping neighbors awake at night. Was a kidnapper actively hunting for their next victim? Now the truth was out. The answer was a definitive, terrifying yes. Yet in the same breath, Nanos offered a bizarre contradiction. He claimed investigators believed the crime was targeted, while simultaneously admitting they were not entirely sure. Targeted, but not sure. It is a wildly ambiguous stance. It is the exact type of vague wording that sparks panic instead of providing comfort. Laura caught that quote on the news. She had already spent 44 agonizing days obsessing over the woman snatched just 4 doors down. Now, she was asking the same question echoing through the entire neighborhood. What does targeted actually mean? What made her the target? Laura began running through the variables. Was Nancy singled out for her money? Was it the notoriety of having a high-profile daughter? Was it simply because she lived entirely alone? An older, vulnerable woman in an isolated home? Maybe an insider memorized the floor plan and saw an easy score. Or maybe the motive was tied to a deeply personal secret the public still does not understand. This distinction matters. If the kidnapper selected their victim based on broad demographics common throughout the Catalina Foothills, wealth, solitude, advanced age, sprawling properties hidden far back from the street, shielded from prying eyes. If those were the criteria, then the sheriff was right. The perpetrator could absolutely strike again. Anyone checking those boxes is currently sitting in the crosshairs. On the flip side, what if this was hyper-specific to Nancy Guthrie? What if it required intimate knowledge of her daily routine, her family dynamics, and her precise medical vulnerabilities? In that scenario, the danger to the surrounding community drops significantly. The sheriff's hesitation reveals a frustrating truth. Detectives lean toward a targeted hit, but they cannot actually define the motive. They simply do not know if this was a predator looking for any vulnerable target or an insider executing a custom-built plan against Nancy. That lingering unknown is tearing through the Catalina Foothills. Residents are completely rethinking their personal safety. They are blanketing their properties in cameras, double-checking deadbolts, suddenly looking at every landscaper, cleaner, and repairman with intense suspicion, demanding identification at the front door, calling parent companies to verify dispatch logs before opening the gate. Laura admitted to quietly upgrading her own defenses after Nancy vanished. She firmly refused to detail exactly what those upgrades look like. It is a smart move. Broadcasting your security protocol on national television instantly renders it useless. But she made one thing clear. The nightmare next door permanently altered how she views the people allowed inside her home. She is far from alone. Dozens of neighbors are overhauling their surveillance grids. Locks are being swapped out. Informal watch groups are forming overnight, creating tight-knit networks just to verify that everyone is still breathing. But as they quietly monitor each other, they are all waiting for the sheriff's next move. The official warning that this attacker could easily strike again completely shifted the local atmosphere, dragging a new wave of heavy paranoia over the community. But whether that panic is actually warranted comes down to classified intelligence currently locked behind closed doors. Nancy Guthrie has now vanished for 44 days without a trace, leaving both the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department hunting for answers. At various points, the massive operation has pulled in well over 400 law enforcement professionals. Right now, roughly 100 federal agents are completely dedicated to this single investigation and its specialized task forces. These federal assets include the Cellular Analysis Survey Team, digital forensics specialists, and investigative genetic genealogy experts. This exact DNA tracking method finally unmasked the Golden State Killer after 4 decades of cold case dead ends. It also directly linked Brian Kohberger to the Idaho student homicides in a matter of weeks. Authorities are unleashing this identical science on biological evidence pulled straight from Nancy's property, and the perpetrator does not even need a prior rap sheet to get caught. They do not have to exist in a single police database anywhere in the country because the entire system hinges on finding just one distant relative, a second cousin, a third cousin, or any blood relation who ever mailed a swab to a commercial genetics company completely breaks the case wide open. Services like 23andMe or Ancestry.com feed into public genealogy networks, where one single partial match builds a massive family tree. Detectives follow those branches forward through the generations, cross-reference the data with public files, and suddenly they have a primary suspect. Meanwhile, federal cellular analysts are actively tracking mobile devices across a series of critical dates. They are scrutinizing February 1st, January 24th, January 11th, along with several other dates they refuse to release to the public. Analysts are hunting for an operational pattern, flagging any smartphone pinging inside the Catalina Foothills across multiple weekends. The goal is to isolate devices present during early surveillance runs and then match them directly to phones active on the exact night someone took Nancy. Agents map this raw GPS data against local cell towers and carrier logs to pinpoint exactly who stood where during those specific windows. These digital footprints have to perfectly line up with the established timeline of the abduction, sparking a massive question about what happens when they catch a familiar ping. That means looking hard at former property workers or individuals with unquestioned, direct access to the house. It also points towards someone possessing enough technical skill to kill the home internet, and the task force might be far closer to making that connection than they are letting on. Cyber technicians are also tearing apart the router logs from Nancy's residence to hunt for digital signatures known as probe requests. Smartphones automatically broadcast these invisible signals into the dark while searching for familiar Wi-Fi networks nearby. It happens constantly in the background of every mobile device, meaning any phone passing within range of that router on the night of February first dropped a traceable digital fingerprint. Technicians easily extract and analyze these pings, and unlike complicated laboratory biology, this kind of forensic work moves incredibly fast. We are talking hours or days to get solid answers, and the FBI currently holds the actual physical router. If an unauthorized smartphone tried to shake hands with that network during the kidnapping, the authorities will absolutely find it. Investigators are also running down transaction logs for the specific Walmart backpack caught on the security footage, leveraging the massive retailer's advanced inventory tracking system. Agents can map the entire supply chain to see exactly which local stores received shipments of that 25-liter Ozark trail bag. Detectives are pulling every single purchase of that item straight from the corporate sales records in the months leading up to February 1st. If the suspect swiped a debit or credit card instead of paying with cash, their real name is already sitting on a digital receipt. Firearm experts analyzing the footage also identified the suspect's gear as a strategy brand revolver holster. Task force members are actively sweeping gun shop logs across the greater Tucson area for recent purchases matching that exact description. Federal agents already hit at least one local armory, holding a stack of 18 to 24 photographs and names. They wanted to know if any of those specific individuals bought a weapon within the last 12 months, but that particular shop came up empty. However, the city is full of other sporting goods stores, different local suppliers, and mountains of unturned transaction records waiting to be pulled. Massive highway billboards flashing Nancy's face and the $1.2 million bounty are now towering over multiple state lines well beyond Arizona. Dispatchers are fielding potential sighting reports from Texas, Southern California, Nevada, and other surrounding territories, prompting the FBI to treat this as a full national manhunt. Nobody knows where they dragged Nancy, or where she might be trapped right now, but the investigative machine is constantly churning. The hard science is yielding data, and crime lab techs are burning through the physical evidence. If the main theory about the bypass security gate holds up, profilers are quietly closing in on a suspect who walked right into Nancy Guthrie's life long before she vanished. Nancy Guthrie called the Catalina Foothills home for a half-century, burying her husband and raising 3 children under that exact same roof. She anchored herself in the community, attending Sunday service every single week and knowing the name of every person living on her block. It was the kind of tight-knit neighborhood where people watched out for each other, and you opened your front door at dinner time without a second thought. Because that is simply how normal people live in a place like that, until a predator weaponized that exact same neighborhood trust to step right across her threshold. That heavy security gate blocking her front door wasn't a new addition. You can spot it right there in the initial crime scene photos. It shows up clearly on the Ring camera video. Crime scene techs walked right past it while combing through the property. Every single news broadcast since February 1st has shown that barrier front and center, yet the true significance of that metal door remained completely overlooked until Laura sat down with Brian Enton to break down its mechanics. She laid out exactly what it takes to bypass that lock, requiring heavy tools, serious muscle, and enough noise to wake the entire block. The public missed this crucial detail, but detectives knew the truth. The masked figure caught on camera wasn't forcing his way inside. He just stood there waiting. Somebody already inside Nancy Guthrie's house had to unlock that heavy metal grate and invite him across the threshold. Whoever turned that deadbolt is currently walking free. Federal agents are actively hunting them down, backed by a mountain of physical evidence pointing straight in their direction. A massive $1.2 million bounty sits on the table for anyone holding the missing piece of the puzzle that names this accomplice and finally brings Nancy back. 44 agonizing days have passed without a single pair of handcuffs, zero formal charges, and no closure. Yet that unforced entry point speaks volumes. It confirms a working theory detectives have kept quiet since day one, a lead they are currently pursuing with massive federal resources. Nancy Guthrie never walked out of her home voluntarily that evening. She had help leaving, and it wasn't by choice. The perpetrator either held a spare key, possessed deep access to the property, or carried enough trust to get invited straight into the living room. The net is rapidly tightening. Hard physical evidence refuses to lie, and the established sequence of events remains locked in stone. Lab technicians are actively testing genetic profiles right now. Analysts are mapping out cell tower pings, while cyber experts strip down every digital footprint left behind. The answer is buried somewhere in the crosshairs of that security video. The blood pooling on the concrete, and a heavy metal door that nobody ever pried open. In that crucial 41-minute window between the lens blacking out and her pacemaker flatlining, a specific name exists. Anyone holding details regarding the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie needs to dial the FBI immediately at 1-800-CALL-FBI. The total payout stands at an incredible $1.2 million. $1 million comes directly from the Guthrie family. Federal authorities threw in another $100,000, with the remaining balance gathered from various community funds. Think back if you recently did contracting work on Nancy's estate, dropped off packages, operated a business out in the Catalina Foothills, or simply noticed a vehicle out of place. Anything spotted over the weekends of January 11th, January 24th, or February 1st could crack this wide open. The smallest detail you brushed off might be the exact missing link detectives need right now, so pick up the phone and contact the tip line. Pay attention if a coworker or acquaintance active in that specific area recently started gossiping about a rich older woman living by herself. If their sudden fascination with that wealthy subdivision struck you as strange back then, authorities need to hear from you today. Maybe you facilitated a cash sale for a 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack out in the Tucson region between December 2025 and January 2026. If that buyer gave you a bad feeling, make the call immediately. Agents are heavily vetting every single submission and chasing down every possible lead. Hit subscribe on Crime Uncovered to stay updated on this active investigation, alongside other major cases where hard facts drive the hunt for justice. Tap the notification bell so you never miss a verified, heavily sourced update as this story develops. Let me know down in the comments, were you aware of the locked entryway before watching this? This single realization completely shatters the original timeline of what unfolded in the dark. Nancy Guthrie absolutely deserves to be brought home. Her loved ones need the truth. And the insider who unlatched that heavy metal door for a masked intruder holds all the answers.